Imagine it's 1922. You're standing in a boardroom in Berlin. Outside the window, the city hums along. Streetcars run on time, bakeries open in the morning, workers collect their wages every Friday. The newspapers say the economy is recovering, the war is over, things are getting better. But inside this room, a man named Hugo Stinnes is doing something that makes no sense to anyone watching. He is borrowing enormous sums of German marks, millions upon millions, and using them to buy everything he can get his hands on. Factories, coal mines, shipping lines, hotels, newspapers, forest land, steel mills. He is buying so aggressively, so relentlessly, that the German press starts calling him a madman. Some call him greedy, others call him reckless. A few quietly call him a traitor. Within 18 months, the German mark collapses. Not declines, collapses. A loaf of bread that cost 160 marks in late 1922 costs 200 billion marks by November 1923. Workers who saved their entire lives watch their bank accounts become worthless in weeks. Pensioners starve. The middle class is destroyed. Not over a generation, but over a single autumn. And Hugo Stinnes, his debts, those millions he borrowed, are now payable in worthless paper. He repays them for virtually nothing. But the factories, the mines, the land, the steel, those are still there. Real, tangible, productive. He emerges from the collapse as the single most powerful industrialist in Germany. He didn't get lucky. He didn't gamble. He simply understood what was coming and converted paper into substance before everyone else realized the paper was dying. This is not a story about one clever man. This is a pattern. And it repeats across centuries, across continents, across every monetary system that has ever broken down. Before every major economic collapse, there is a quiet migration of wealth. Not loud, not obvious, not announced on the evening news. The people who already have capital begin converting it out of the financial instruments that the general public trusts and into a very specific set of assets that most people don't think about until it's far too late. This isn't theory. It's documented history. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. To understand what the wealthy buy before a collapse, you first have to understand what they're selling. And to understand what they're selling, you have to understand what most people believe about money and why that belief is the first thing that breaks. Most people think of wealth and money as the same thing. They're not. Money is a claim. Wealth is the thing the claim is supposed to be redeemable for. When you hold a dollar or a euro or a bond or a share in a fund, you are holding a promise. A promise that at some future point, this piece of paper, this number on a screen, can be exchanged for something real: food, energy, land, shelter, labor. The entire financial system is built on the assumption that those promises will be honored, that the number in your retirement account means something, that the government bond in your pension fund will be paid back, that the currency in your savings account will still buy groceries next year. And most of the time, for most people, that assumption holds. The system works. The promises are kept. The bread gets bought. But the wealthy, the genuinely wealthy, not the high-income earners who spend what they make, but the people who have held and grown capital across generations, they operate on a different assumption entirely. They know that promises are only as good as the system that enforces them. And they watch that system more closely than anyone. They watch the debt ratios. They watch the central bank's balance sheet. They watch the gap between what a government owes and what it can realistically collect in taxes. They watch the political dynamics that make fiscal reform impossible. And when the math stops working, not when it breaks, but when it becomes clear that it eventually must break, they begin to move, not all at once, not in a panic, quietly, methodically, into assets that don't depend on a promise being kept. That's the mechanism. That's what people miss. The wealthy don't predict collapses. They don't have crystal balls. They have accountants. They have advisors who read sovereign debt reports. They have family offices that run scenarios. And when the scenarios start converging on the same outcome, that the existing monetary arrangement is unsustainable, they rotate out of paper and into substance. Let's talk about what that substance looks like, because it's remarkably consistent, no matter the era, no matter the country, no matter the specific type of crisis. The first asset class, and the most historically consistent one, is land. Not real estate in the speculative sense, not condominiums and overheated urban markets. Land, agricultural land, productive land, timber, water rights, soil that can grow food. In every single major currency crisis and economic collapse of the last 300 years, there's a documented pattern of wealthy individuals and families increasing their acquisition of farmland in the years immediately preceding the breakdown. In Weimar Germany, it wasn't just Stinnes. The Junker aristocracy, the old Prussian landowning class, were among the few groups that survived the hyperinflation intact. Their wealth was in land, in soil, in wheat, and rye, and cattle. While urban savers lost everything, the landowners simply kept producing. The currency changed. The land didn't. In Argentina, And this is worth studying closely because Argentina has experienced more currency crises than almost any modern nation. The pattern is nearly identical. Before the 2001 collapse, when the peso was depegged from the dollar and lost roughly 75% of its value in months, wealthy Argentine families had already been accumulating estancias, large agricultural estates in the Pampas, for years. They weren't speculating on land prices. They were exiting the peso. The land was the vehicle, not the investment. In Zimbabwe, during the hyperinflationary collapse of 2007 to 2009, those who held productive farmland, particularly in the few cases where it wasn't seized, saw their real wealth preserved while the Zimbabwean dollar became literally worthless. The country printed a $100 trillion note. It couldn't buy a bus ticket. But an acre of arable land still grew maize. In the United States, more recently, something interesting has been happening. Over the last 15 years, billionaires have been quietly accumulating farmland at an unprecedented rate. Bill Gates is now the largest private owner of farmland in America, with over 270,000 acres across dozens of states. Ted Turner owns roughly 2 million acres. John Malone, the media billionaire, owns 2.2 million acres, an area larger than Delaware and Rhode Island combined. Major institutional investors, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, family offices, have been increasing their farmland allocations steadily since the 2008 financial crisis. Now, this isn't to say that these individuals are predicting an imminent collapse, but it is to say that they are doing exactly what wealthy individuals have always done in the late stages of a debt cycle, converting financial claims into physical productivity. They are buying the thing that remains when the system that denominates value resets. Think about what farmland represents. It produces food, the most inelastic commodity on earth. It appreciates in real terms during inflationary periods. It cannot be printed. It cannot be digitally created. It cannot be debased by a central bank. It is, in the most literal sense, ground truth. The second asset class is gold, and here the history is so overwhelming that ignoring it requires deliberate effort. Gold is not a speculation. It is not a hedge. It is not a trade. Gold is what money reverts to when trust in institutions fails. This is not a philosophical claim. It is an empirical observation drawn from 5,000 years of recorded economic history. Before the collapse of the Roman denarius, which was systematically debased from nearly pure silver under Augustus to less than 5% silver by the late 3rd century, Roman senators and wealthy patricians had already been hoarding gold ori and converting their wealth into landed estates. The common soldier, paid in increasingly worthless denarii, could barely afford grain. The senator, holding gold and land, simply waited. Before the French Revolution, in the years leading up to 1789, the French aristocracy, aware that the assignat system was unsustainable, moved significant portions of their wealth into gold, jewels, and foreign assets. Many of them transferred gold to banks in London and Geneva, not because they predicted revolution, but because they understood that the French crown's fiscal position was terminal. The monarchy owed more than it could ever repay. The currency had to break. Gold was the exit. In the 1930s, as the Great Depression deepened and the American banking system began to fail, those with means moved heavily into gold. By 1933, the outflow of gold from the banking system was so severe that Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102, making it illegal for private citizens to own monetary gold. Think about what that means. The government didn't ban gold because it was irrelevant. It banned gold because too many people were choosing it over the dollar. The wealthy were voting with their vaults, and the government had to stop them to prevent the entire monetary system from draining out. In 1971, when Richard Nixon closed the gold window, ending the ability of foreign governments to redeem dollars for gold, the price of gold was fixed at $35 an ounce. By 1980, it had reached $850. That's not a return. That's a repricing of everything denominated in dollars. The people who held gold before 1971 didn't make money. They preserved wealth while the measuring stick shrank. Today, central banks themselves are buying gold at the fastest pace in decades. In 2022 and 2023, global central bank gold purchases exceeded 1,000 tons per year, numbers not seen since the 1960s. China, Russia, India, Turkey, Poland, Singapore, they are all accumulating. These are not retail investors following a trend. These are sovereign institutions with teams of economists who see what the debt math looks like, and they are doing exactly what wealthy individuals have always done before a reset. They are converting paper claims into the one monetary asset that carries no counterparty risk. Let that sink in. The institutions that issue the paper are themselves buying the metal. The third asset, and one that often surprises people, is art, fine art. Blue-chip paintings, rare antiquities, museum-grade sculpture. Most people think of art collecting as a hobby of the ultra-rich, a vanity exercise, something billionaires do because they've run out of things to buy. That's a misunderstanding. Art, at the highest level, functions as a portable, unregistered, internationally transferable store of value that exists outside the banking system. A painting by Monet doesn't have a ticker symbol. It doesn't appear on a bank's balance sheet. It isn't reported to tax authorities automatically the way a brokerage account is. It can be stored in a free port in Geneva or Luxembourg, a tax-free, customs-free storage facility where billions of dollars in art sit in climate-controlled vaults, unseen by the public, unreported to any government. Before the 2008 financial crisis, art auction prices at Christie's and Sotheby's hit record after record. In the 2 years before Lehman Brothers collapsed, the art market saw its highest volumes in history. Wealthy individuals weren't suddenly developing a passion for Impressionism. They were moving wealth into a non-correlated, non-reportable, physically transportable asset class. This is not new. During World War II, wealthy European Jewish families who managed to survive the Holocaust often did so in part because they had converted portions of their wealth into small, portable, high-value items, diamonds, gold coins, and small masterwork paintings. These could be sewn into a coat lining, carried across a border, hidden in a wall. A bank account in Berlin could be frozen by the Nazi government with a single order. A Vermeer hidden in a farmhouse could not. During the fall of the Soviet Union, as the ruble collapsed and the planned economy disintegrated, the Russian oligarchs who emerged from the wreckage became some of the most aggressive art buyers in the world. Roman Abramovich, Leonid Blavatnik, Dmitry Rybolovlev. They weren't buying art because they loved Rothko. They were buying art because a $100 million painting is $100 million that no government can freeze, devalue, or inflate away. It sits in a crate in a Swiss free port. It has no IBAN number. It exists outside the system. This is the pattern. When the system becomes fragile, wealth moves to things that exist outside the system. The fourth asset class is foreign currency, or more precisely, foreign jurisdiction. This is where the pattern becomes most uncomfortable because it reveals a truth that most people don't want to confront. The wealthy don't just diversify their investments, they diversify their countries. Before the Argentine peso collapsed in 2001, wealthy Argentines had already been moving dollars to bank accounts in Miami, Montevideo, and Zurich for years. Capital flight out of Argentina in the 2 years before the crisis exceeded $20 billion. The middle class, trusting the banking system, left their savings in peso-denominated accounts. On December 1st, 2001, the government imposed the corralito, a freeze on all bank withdrawals. Overnight, the savings of ordinary Argentines were locked behind a wall. Those who had already moved their money offshore were untouched. Before the Greek debt crisis of 2010 to 2015, wealthy Greek families had transferred an estimated over 60 billion euros to banks in London, Switzerland, and Germany. By the time capital controls were imposed in June 2015, limiting ATM withdrawals to 60 euros per day, the money was already gone. Not all of it, but the money that mattered, the generational wealth, the operating capital, the cushion. Before Venezuela's economic collapse, which accelerated dramatically after 2014, wealthy Venezuelans had been buying apartments in Miami, Panama City, and Madrid for over a decade. Doral, Florida, became so heavily populated by Venezuelan expatriates that locals started calling it Doralzuela. These weren't immigrants fleeing poverty. These were wealthy. Families who saw the debt trajectory, the oil dependency, the monetary expansion, and the political incentive structure, and concluded that the Bolivar had no future. They didn't wait for confirmation. They didn't wait for the currency to lose 99.9% of its value. They moved early, they moved quietly, and they moved into hard assets denominated in currencies backed by more stable institutional frameworks. This is the part that stings, because what it reveals is that the wealthy treat national borders as a variable, not a constant. For most people, your country is your financial identity, your bank account, your pension, your property, your savings. They all exist within one jurisdiction, under one government, denominated in one currency. If that currency fails, or that government imposes controls, you are trapped. The wealthy are never trapped, because they already left, not physically, financially. Their wealth lives in multiple jurisdictions, multiple currencies, multiple legal structures, a trust in Liechtenstein, a holding company in Singapore, a bank account in Switzerland, a ranch in New Zealand, a passport from Portugal. This isn't illegal. Most of it is entirely within the law, but it is a structural advantage that only exists for those who have enough capital to access it. And it means that when the system breaks, when the corralito comes, when the capital controls hit, when the currency is redenominated, the people who designed the system, or profited most from it, are already on the other side of the wall. The people who trusted the system are the ones locked inside. Now, there's a fifth category, and it's the most modern, and in some ways the most revealing. It's infrastructure, not public infrastructure, private infrastructure. The kind of infrastructure that provides essential services, water, energy, data, logistics, and generates revenue regardless of what the broader economy does. In the years following the 2008 financial crisis, there was an enormous and largely unreported shift in institutional capital allocation. Sovereign wealth funds, major endowments, and ultra-high net worth family offices began pouring capital into infrastructure assets: toll roads, ports, electricity grids, water treatment facilities, data centers, pipeline networks. The logic is the same as farmland, but scaled up. These are assets that produce essential revenue. People need water, whether the stock market is up or down. People need electricity, whether the currency is strong or weak. Trucks still need to cross bridges. Ships still need to dock. Data still needs to be stored. When you own the infrastructure, you don't just survive a collapse. You own the choke points that everyone else depends on during the recovery. You become, in effect, a private tax collector, not through government authority, but through ownership of the systems that society cannot function without. This is what happened in the post-Soviet privatization era. A small number of well-connected individuals acquired state-owned infrastructure: oil pipelines, aluminum smelters, telecommunications networks, nickel mines, for fractions of their actual value. Within a decade, those individuals became the oligarchs, not because they were smarter, not because they worked harder, because they understood that when a system resets, the person who owns the physical infrastructure owns the next system. The same pattern played out in post-war Britain. The same pattern played out during the railway consolidations of the American Gilded Age. The same pattern played out in post-reunification Germany, where Western capital acquired Eastern industrial infrastructure at deep discounts. The asset changes shape. The pattern doesn't. So let's step back and look at what we've actually described. Before every major economic collapse, the same migration occurs. Wealth moves from paper to land, from currency to gold, from regulated accounts to portable valuables, from domestic jurisdiction to foreign jurisdiction, from financial assets to physical infrastructure. This isn't a conspiracy. There's no secret meeting where billionaires decide to buy farmland simultaneously. It's something more structural than that, and in some ways more disturbing. It's an emergent behavior driven by a simple reality. The people who have the most capital also have the most access to information about the fragility of the system. They can afford the analysts, the legal structures, the international accounts, and the advisors who understand sovereign debt math. They don't need to predict the future. They just need to read the present more accurately than everyone else. And the present right now is saying something very specific. Let's look at the math. Global sovereign debt currently exceeds $100 trillion. The United States national debt alone is past $34 trillion. The Congressional Budget Office projects that interest payments on that debt will exceed $1 trillion per year within the next 24 months, surpassing the entire defense budget. Japan's debt-to-GDP ratio is over 260%. China's total debt, including local government, corporate, and a household, exceeds 300% of GDP. The European Central Bank's balance sheet expanded from roughly 2 trillion euros in 2014 to nearly 9 trillion by 2022. None of this debt will be repaid in real terms. That's not an opinion. That's arithmetic. When a government's debt grows faster than its economy, persistently, structurally, with no political mechanism to reverse course, there are only three possible outcomes. 1. Default. The government simply refuses to pay. This destroys the bond market, crashes the banking system, and typically triggers a depression. It is politically catastrophic. Almost no major government voluntarily defaults on domestic currency debt. 2. Austerity. The government cuts spending and raises taxes enough to close the gap. This requires reducing pensions, healthcare, military spending, and social programs simultaneously while increasing the tax burden on the population. It is economically painful and politically almost impossible in a democracy. Voters remove any government that tries it. Greece attempted it under Troika supervision, and it resulted in a 25% contraction in GDP and social unrest that nearly broke the country. 3. Inflation. The government allows or encourages the central bank to hold interest rates below the rate of inflation, effectively eroding the real value of the debt over time. The debt is repaid, but in currency that buys less. Savers are quietly taxed. Wages lag behind prices. The middle class shrinks. The government's books improve. This is the path of least resistance. It is, historically, the path that is almost always chosen. This is what economists call financial repression. It was the strategy used by the United States and Britain after World War II to reduce debt-to-GDP ratios that had reached over 100%. From 1945 to 1980, real interest rates in the U.S. were negative for roughly half the period. If you held government bonds, you lost purchasing power slowly, invisibly, and continuously. The government didn't default. It didn't cut spending dramatically. It simply let inflation quietly eat the debt and the savings of anyone who held dollars or dollar-denominated bonds. It worked. Debt to GDP fell from over 110% to under 35%. But the cost was borne entirely by savers, by people who trusted the system, by the middle class. The wealthy, those who held land, gold, equities, infrastructure, and foreign assets, saw their real wealth increase. That's the trap. And this is where the historical pattern becomes directly relevant to today. Because the conditions that precede every major wealth transfer, excessive sovereign debt, expanding central bank balance sheets, negative real interest rates, political inability to reform, and a growing gap between financial asset values and underlying economic productivity are all present right now, not in one country, globally. When you see billionaires buying farmland, you're not watching a trend, you're watching a signal. When you see central banks buying gold at record pace, you are not watching portfolio diversification. You are watching institutions preparing for a world where the current arrangement of monetary trust cannot hold. When you see art market prices reaching record highs at exactly the same time that government debt reaches record highs, you're not watching a coincidence. You're watching the same pattern that has preceded every monetary reset in modern history. Now, let me be precise about something. I'm not saying a collapse is imminent. I'm not saying the dollar will fail next year or that the bond market will crash next quarter. I don't make predictions. Predictions are a fool's game. Systems can persist far longer than anyone expects. The Roman denarius was debased for 200 years before the monetary system fully broke down. The British pound lost its reserve currency status gradually, over decades, not in a single event. What I am saying is this: the math has a direction. The political incentives have a direction. The behavior of those with the most information and the most capital has a direction. And all three are pointing the same way. The wealthy are not buying what they're buying because they're greedy. They're buying it because they can read. They can read balance sheets. They can read central bank minutes. They can read demographic projections and entitlement obligations and interest expense forecasts. And when all of those documents tell the same story, that the existing arrangement is unsustainable, they act accordingly. The question is not whether they're right. The question is what it means for everyone who doesn't have the same access, the same mobility, the same structural advantages, because that's who always pays the cost, not the people who moved early, the people who trusted the system to protect them. In Weimar Germany, the middle class was destroyed, not the poor. They had little to lose, not the rich. They had already converted. The middle class, the teachers, the doctors, the engineers, the civil servants, the people who saved diligently, who put money in the bank, who bought government bonds because they believed in the system. They were wiped out, not by war, not by famine, but by the mathematics of monetary debasement. In Argentina, in 2001, it was the same. The Corralito didn't trap the oligarchs. It trapped the shopkeepers, the small business owners, the retirees, the people who believed the peso was safe because the government said it was pegged to the dollar. The peg broke, the savings were frozen, the wealth was gone. In the United States, after 2008, it was the same pattern wearing a different suit. The banks were rescued. The homeowners were not. 11 million Americans lost their homes to foreclosure between 2008 and 2014. Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve's quantitative easing program pumped trillions of dollars into financial markets, inflating the value of stocks, bonds, and real estate, assets disproportionately held by the top 10% of the wealth distribution. The bottom 50% of Americans owned essentially no financial assets at all. They received no benefit from the asset inflation. But they did receive the cost in stagnant wages, rising rents, and an economy that recovered on paper but never recovered on the ground. This is not a conspiracy, it's a structure. The system is designed, not maliciously but mechanically, to socialize losses and privatize gains. When the system works, everyone benefits to some degree. When it breaks, the losses flow downward and the recoveries flow upward. The wealthy don't cause this. They simply understand it, and they position themselves accordingly. So what does this mean for someone watching this who isn't a billionaire, who doesn't have a family office or a trust in Liechtenstein or 200,000 acres of farmland in Kansas? I'm not going to give investment advice. That's not what this channel does. But I will say this. Understanding the pattern is itself a form of protection. Not because you can replicate what the ultra-wealthy do at their scale. You can't. But because understanding the mechanism allows you to stop doing the one thing that guarantees you'll be on the wrong side of the transfer. And that one thing is blind trust. Trust that the currency will hold its value because it always has. Trust that your pension will be there because it was promised. Trust that the government will protect your savings because that's what governments are supposed to do. Trust that the system is stable because no one on television is saying otherwise. The people who get hurt in every collapse aren't the people who made bad investments. They're the people who made no decision at all, who assumed the default setting was safe, who didn't look at the math because they assumed someone else was looking at it for them. The wealthy don't trust the system. They use the system. There's a difference. And when the system shows signs of structural failure, they move to assets that exist independently of it. Land, gold, essential infrastructure, portable high-value goods, foreign jurisdiction. real things that produce real value or hold real scarcity, regardless of what any central bank does, the names of the assets change slightly from century to century. The principle does not. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial or investment advice. What you do with your own capital, in your own circumstances, is your own decision. There's one more thing worth saying, and it's the part that makes this pattern so difficult for most people to accept. Every time this happens, every time a system breaks and wealth transfers upward, there's a moment afterward where everyone asks the same question. How did we not see this coming? And the answer is always the same. You didn't see it coming because the people who did see it coming had no incentive to warn you. The banker who knew the mortgage market was unsustainable in 2006 didn't go on television and say so. He bought credit default swaps. The industrialist who knew the mark was dying in 1922 didn't write editorials. He bought factories. The Argentine oligarch who knew the peso was doomed in 2000 didn't stage a protest. He wired dollars to a bank in Miami. The people who understand the system don't try to fix it. They position around it. And then, when it breaks, they buy what's left at a discount. This isn't cynicism, it's history. And the pattern is already in motion. The question was never whether the wealthy prepare for collapses. They always do. The only question that matters, is whether you understand what they already know. And if you don't, whose fault is that? This channel doesn't exist to tell you what to buy. It exists to show you the patterns that most people don't see until the cost has already been paid. If that kind of analysis matters to you, then staying informed is the only edge that doesn't require a billion-dollar balance sheet.